So hey everyone, this is Vipul Singh, and today topic is what a React.js. So what is React.js and what is the thing which is we have to cover in that scenario? So I'm gonna discuss about these things here. Okay. So the first thing first, let me just talk about what the topic which is we are gonna cover here. So the first thing we're gonna cover about the stateful components, or how to create a components in React.js. That things which is we're gonna cover. The second point is that how we can use JSX inside the render method. That thing which is we're gonna cover here, and after that we're gonna cover data. So that is what data flow using props. Okay, and the fourth point which is we are going to cover utilizing a lifecycle method. So how to use a lifecycle method in React.js. So that thing which is also we're gonna cover here. And the last but not least, which is we're gonna cover here, state and set state. So what is the state and set state inside the React.js? So that things we are going to cover here. Okay. So the first thing which is when I talk about what we are going to build here. So I'm going to show you this output, what we are going to build here today. So this is the output. So this is just like a card. So here we can say that this is an image. This is the heading, the titles, and that user specific name, and this is the avatar of that user, and this is a like a likes button. If someone it's like that post, or so in that scenario they will just press on this caret button, and that on that basis, so they're gonna just increase that likes and so on. Okay, so that's the things which is we are going to build here, guys. So let's move ahead and let's check out. Let's go back to our Visual Studio Code. So here I'm using a Visual Studio Code. You can use any editor whichever you want that. Okay, so let's go back. So what I'm gonna do here, I just move back to that React.js. Okay, so the first thing first, guys, if I talk about what is React.js. So most probably when I talk about React.js is nothing like what, it's a library. It's a UI front-end library which is used to build a UI specific components. Okay, so so most probably if I talk about React.js, so React.js, it's, if I talk about like as a real scenario, React.js is a particular library. So when I talk about library, so library is nothing like what, if we talk about it's like a part of kitchen. So that means what, React, it's not focusing all the things. They're not focusing all kind of packages. They are just only focused here how we can make a UI interactive, and that is what, that is the things which is we using a React.js here. Okay, so I'm using her Visual Studio Code here. So let me just fonts make increase. After that, I will create whole things via scratch. So I will remove, this is a by default code. So whenever if you install React.js, so in that scenario, you will get a such kinds of code. Okay, so what I want to do here, I just want to remove all this code here, and I just use import, then React. It's called from that React here. Okay, and after that, I will just use import, that is called React DOM from React DOM. Okay, then we have to render these things. So I just call to React DOM render, and inside this render we have to give a specific by default component. So what is component, I will just discuss as soon as possible. So import, first I'm going to import the my by default component. So the app which is I call to dot / app. So now here I just use this app as a component, and then I say document dot get element bar id root. So what I'm doing here, so basically is what, it's like a main dependency. This is a word is basically like a my main root. So that things, it's called to my HTML page. So when I just run this file, So when I just run this file, if I save this file again, and now if I move back to browser, so I'm going to show you how it looks like. So let me show you. Okay, so this is the kind of output which is I'm just getting here. Now if I inspect these things, I can say view page source, and if you just observe inside the body, we have only one specific tag here, that is called div id, just like normal HTML we use. So here we have a div, then id is equal to that double quotes root. So basically, whenever if you're creating any React project, so that's now what is going to happen. They have a one specific main root, and that main root, it's get attached to a child component. So well, basically what is component? So component is nothing like what is a piece of UI building blocks. So that means what is going to happen, I'm going to show you. So what I want to do here, I just want to show you one thing here. So if I move back to this whiteboard here, and let me show you one thing. Okay, now is this perfect? Okay, now you can see that thing. Yes. Okay, so what I'm doing here, I just created one button here that is called my main root. Now in this main root, what we have to build, so that is what it's like a command. So normally what we do, let's imagine if you want to create any application, just like we use in traditional approach. If I talk about traditional approach, so in this traditional approach, how we build a web application basically. So let's imagine we have this application here, and now this application we have a, this is like a navigation, for example. So this is what my navigation, and here what I'm doing here, so like that. So this is one a sidebar, aside. Just copy this aside here to right hand side. Okay, and also I want to use one footer here. All right. Okay, so this is what footer. So this is the kind of application we build in a traditional approach, just like we say, just like we use in a traditional approach. But what about the component, how the component looks like? But this is just, it's a one single page, right? If we talk as a traditional way, when I talk about this is only one single page. In that page we have we just using navigation code, also a side code also, then we have this main section here. Inside of that we have another side one, then we have another footer. So what component does do here? So components basically what is doing here, it's just distributing all the code as like a file, it's like a package. So what actually is doing is nothing like what, it's piece of UI building blocks. When I talk about components, basically what is a piece of UI building blocks. So let's imagine if I want to create this application as a component base, so how we can use. So well, in that scenario, the first thing was how we can define these things. So here we just create my main root, just like I just told you here. Now this main root, they have a n number of childs, so you can create any specific child whichever you want that, like here, and you can just create like this way. Okay, so it's like so even you can just create like here. Okay, so now which is we can just use these components again, like just like whichever you want that. So root, just imagine this is what my navigation component, and this is like my aside component. Okay, like so, aside component. So what is the uses to whenever defining a component based structure? Well, component based structure is basically like you can reusable the code. Like what, So let's imagine in futures our client say, hey, just remove this part and just call this part to over here, there to main section. I do not want to use this main section here. I just want to use this aside to here, and this main section I just want to call the right corner. Okay. So uh, let's, if we building this application as a traditional way, that is very hectic to maintain a such kind of application, and that is the reason the Reactjs, it came using a like a word component based structure. So basically, if I talk about React, it's all over just like a component based structure, and components basically nothing like what is a piece of UI building blocks. Okay, so that's the thing which is I'm creating here. All right, guys. So let's move ahead and let's see what we can do in that scenario. So I just move back to my code editor. Okay, so what I will do here, I'll just come back to, there you go. So now here, already I just call this import React from React, and then just again import React down. So React down is just like for rendering process, and also we're using this import app from the app here. Okay, perfect. So that is what we're gonna call. They're gonna call to our main root division. So this is what my component which is I'm using here, import app. So in this app is like a my by default app component. Okay, so I'm gonna remove all these things here. The first thing first, I just want to use a bootstrap for the interactive UI. So I already have installed this package inside my this uh, project directory. So I can just directly call that path. So dot forward slash node modules, and I just call to bootstrap forward slash, just call to dist forward slash css, and it's called to main.css. And also I just want to use a word uh, like icon. So I just call to node modules forward slash font awesome, then forward slash css, then forward slash font awesome dot main dot css. Okay, so this is the setup which is I just done here. Now let's move back to app.js. So the app.js was my main component. Okay, so as you can see here inside of that, so here we can see in the src folder we have some different file here like app.css, app.js. We also have a testing file also, and you can get an index.css file also, which is a by default css file. Then also we have this index.js here. Okay, so the first thing first, what I will do here, I just move back to this app.js, and first thing we have to create a by default component, which is our main component we have to create here. So how we can create here? But well, basically just like told you here, you know what, I just told you that what kind of component we have to create here. So I'm gonna show you what kind of component I'm gonna create here. So I just move back to again to my slide, and I'm gonna show you how to define. So what kind of components we're gonna create here? So basically in React.js, you can create two different kinds of components. When I say that, so the first component is basically is called a stateful component, and the second one is called a stateless component. So when I say stateful component, that means what? A component is basically like a class-based components. And when I say stateless components, that means what? In that components, you cannot use a class-based structure, right? You cannot use like class things like your class constructor. You cannot use that. So that is what called stateless component. So React is give it two-way. You can define it. You can create a two-way components. The first one is what stateful components, and the second one is what a stateless component. So here I'm going to cover a stateful component, but some people say which one is best, which components we can use. Well, it's depend on you. You can create any component just like you want. You can use a class based component also. You can create a state function based component. So stateful is basically like a class based, and the state is basically like a function based component. Okay, so here I'm going to use a stateful component, because stateful component is give you a lot of varieties. Like I say, you can use a life cycle lifecycle method also. You can create a constructor, you can inherit any component which you want that, and that things which is they provide. But if I talk about the lifecycle hook and all that, you can use in a status also, but using a React hook. Okay, but there you cannot use a lifecycle hook method inside a stateless component. So on the basis of, you can use a React hook, because React just also provided React hook. So on the basis of, we can use any lifecycle method just like we use in a stateful component. In that scenario, you can use any lifecycle method which you want in a state test component. You have to use a React hook here. Okay, so I'm using a stateful component. It's up to you which kind of company you want to create. If you want to use that life cycle hook and everything, so you have to create a stateful component. Or if you know about the React hook and all that, so in that scenario you can use a stateless component. Okay, so for now clear. So stateful, it's like a class based, and the stateless is like a function based component. Okay guys, so here I'm gonna cover a stateful component. Okay, so now let's move back to our editor. So first thing first, I'm gonna create my by default component. So how we can create a stateful component? So here I can just import that React. This is the API we have to call. So import React from React simple, and then we have to create a class. So yeah, just using this class name, which is app, because of what my default component name is app. You can give any specific name, but one thing you have to remember, whenever if you call this component to a main root, that specific name you have to call here. Okay, so if we call any specific name here, like anything xyz, let's call, if I call to xyz, so that xyz you have to import here also, and you have to call here also, which is called xy kind of, for example. Okay, so now class name is what, app. So here I'm just using class app, so that should be all are small. Okay, here, so, and it's called to class app. Okay, and one thing, whenever if you're creating any specific class based component, so you have to extend another class, that is, you have to inherit another class that is called component. So what we have to do, or you also have to import a component. So component is a by default class component. So whenever if you're creating any class based component, and if you want to call any JSX or any lifecycle hook method, if you want to call, so using this class you can just call that method. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, I just call to class app, then I just call to extend keyword, just like nothing like we are using an inheritance. So now I'm using this component, which is another class, and then I just use open curly braces and close curly braces. Okay, so now in that scenario, what we have to do, so in that scenario we can call the constructor, which is a by default constructor, and after that we have to call a JSX. So well, basically I'm going to show you how, what is JSX basically. So just like told you in a section, which is as mentioned that what we're gonna call here. So what is JSX basically? So well, basically if I talk about JSX, it's nothing like what it looks like a JavaScript XML. So when I say JavaScript XML, that means what, whatever the HTML CSS, just like suppose if you want to create any UI, right? So in that UI, what we do, so in that scenario we just use HTML and CSS. Okay, so how we can use HTML CSS inside the React.js? So on the basis of, you have to use a JSX, but JSX, it's not like a normal HTML CSS. It looks like HTML CSS, but it's not HTML CSS. Okay, you have to remember. So here, whenever if you want to create any UI, if you want to show any UI on browser, so you have to create a JSX. So what we can do in that scenario, how we can create this JSX? So well, basically I just go back to my editor, so I'm going to show you how we can use this JSX here. So Let me move back to my code editor, and now I'm gonna show you. So here you have to use one render method. Okay, this is render method. Now in this render method, you have to call a return. Now in this return, what we have to do? So in this return, we have to call. We can call any specific division, just like we use for HTML5 and CSS3. So now here, I just use div class and using a bootstrap class name, which is called container. Okay. Now in this container, I'm just simply using one specific tag. Then I say app section. Okay. Like so, I just call this is called a app section. After that, we have to import this class. So export default app. Okay. So we can just call the export default app. Now, if I save all this file, and once if I move back to browser, I'm gonna show you how it looks like. So I just move back to my Chrome tab. So I'm just gonna show you how it looks like. So here we are getting one error here. So the error is say you must call a super constructor. We can see here. So we are getting here errors like you must call a super constructor in derived class before accessing this or returning from the derived constructor. So what is like that? Which kind of error is that? So definitely the error is basically it belongs to what our code. Just like what I did here, I just created one class app, and now in this class I'm just inherited another class that is called component. But what Reactjs is say, so what ES6 JavaScript say, in one single class you can create only one constructor at a time. So that means what is going to happen here? Now this constructor, it belongs to this class app. Okay. Now this constructor belongs to this class app which is I created. Now here I'm just inherited, that is what another class. So it's probably is going to happen in that component also they get one another constructor also. So that means what, whenever I inherited any class to the another class, so might be there chances we get a two constructor at the same time. So how we can access a base class constructor into a derived class constructor? So in that scenario, so whenever if you inherited any class component into another class, so once if we creating any constructor, so in that constructor you have to use one super method. Okay, so this super is basically it's give the reference to the your base class constructor. So now if I save this file, if I just move back to our just like that browser, so let me show you how what we get here. And as you can see here, we are getting here what our app section, just like we wrote inside the JSX component. Okay guys, so you have to remember one thing. Whenever if you're creating any component, class based component which is called a stateful component, so in that stateful component is very important. You know what, it's very important. First thing first, what we have to import, that's very important. So I'm going to show you step by step. So I just move back to again on my Visual Studio Code. So what we have to do here, so in that scenario you can just see that the first thing first we have to write a one sentence that is called import React, and that is what the API that is they call to that React. Hey React, you have to render this component. And after that, whenever if you're using a stateful component, so you have to call another class which is called component. Okay, and just import from a React. The first thing. Second thing, what we have to do, you have to create one class. So that I just called it as class app, and I just using which is I just calling to base class to my derived class. Okay, so on the basis of what you have to use the keyword which is called extends, and I'm calling that component inside of my class app class. Okay, now now here I'm using a constructor. So now this constructor it belongs to what my main class app. That's very important. So in might be they will get such kinds of error. Okay, so they're saying, hey, we have a one constructor inside the component class also. So what we'll do? So in that scenario, if you want to access a base class constructor into a derived class constructor, so you have to use a super method. You have to call that super method inside our derived constructor. Okay. Once it's done, after that, what we just created a JSX. So basically for JSX, if you want to access a JSX, we have to use a method which is called render. So that render, they will need a one callback, so which is the user return. So return is like a method. In that method you have to write your all the JSX estimates. So one thing, if you notice here, I'm just using division class container. Okay, it seems, it looks like a html, but it's not html. I'm going to show you how.